This is the story of Miss Evelyn Blackwood, a Boston spinster who never planned to leave her world of books and proper society. When her stagecoach abandons her in the bitter Wyoming winter of 1885, she finds herself at the mercy of the untamed frontier. Jake McCall hasn't welcomed anyone to his ranch since losing his wife 2 years ago. The locals call him the Widowmaker, a man as cold as the territory he inhabits. But on this freezing night, these two lost souls are about to cross paths. Will the storm that brings them together be strong enough to break down the walls they've both built around their hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Cheyenne Rail Depot creaked beneath Evelyn Blackwood's feet as she hugged her cameo brooch closer to her throat. After 6 days of rail travel, the delicate pin was the only part of her that still felt like Boston. Behind her, a porter struggled, with her trunk, its brass corners gleaming despite the dust of the journey. She'd filled it with books and proper dresses, none of which seemed to belong in this raw, untamed place. "Last stage to Thunder Valley leaves in 20 minutes, miss," the station master's voice carried over the howling wind. "Best hurry if you're wanting passage." Evelyn clutched her ticket, the paper thin and damp with nervous sweat. At 32, she was well past the age when most women had secured their futures through marriage. But marriage had never been her destiny. Instead, she'd built a life among her father's library, cataloguing rare books and living in the worlds between their pages. Until the telegram came. She pulled it from her reticule now, though she'd memorized every word. Position available. Thunder Valley Schoolhouse. Teacher needed immediately. Room and board provided. Reply soon. It wasn't just a teaching position. It was her last chance at independence. "Stage won't wait forever, miss." The station master called again, his mustache twitching with impatience. Through the depot windows, she could see the stagecoach waiting, its red paint barely visible through the gathering snowfall. The other passengers had already boarded, a missionary clutching his Bible and a wool merchant with wild eyebrows. They stared at her through the windows, wondering perhaps what a proper Boston lady was doing so far from home. "Weather's turning fierce," the stage master warned, pointing to the darkening sky. "Might want to wait for tomorrow's stage." But tomorrow's stage might never come, and she'd already sold most of her father's books to afford this journey. There would be no turning back. "I'll take my chances," she said, smoothing her skirts. The words came out stronger than she felt. The porter loaded her trunk while she climbed aboard, taking the backward-facing seat. As the horses started forward, she caught one last glimpse of the depot through swirling snow. Her old life was already disappearing into the whiteness. Inside the stage, the missionary introduced himself as Reverend Parker, but Evelyn barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on the landscape rushing past the windows. Gone were Boston's neat brick rows and cultivated gardens. Here, nature ruled with an iron fist. Wind-carved rocks thrust up from the earth like ancient bones. Scraggly pines clung to hillsides, their branches bent permanently westward by the relentless wind. "Nasty storm brewing," the wool merchant muttered, pulling his coat tighter. "Drivers are fool to push on in this weather." As if in answer, the stage lurched violently. Evelyn grabbed the leather strap beside her seat, her knuckles white. Hours passed in tense silence as the storm grew fiercer. The windows became frosted panes, offering only occasional glimpses of the desolate landscape. When the stage finally ground to a halt, Evelyn's heart leaped to her throat. Through the ice-crusted glass, she could make out the driver and his assistant in heated discussion, gesturing at the sky and the horses. The door yanked open, letting in a blast of Arctic air. "End of the line, folks," the driver announced. "Storm's too dangerous. We're turning back to Cheyenne." "But Thunder Valley," Evelyn started, "is still 20 miles ahead," he cut her off, "and likely to be our death if we try for it. There's an old line shack about a mile back. We passed it just before the worst hit. Best chance is to wait out the storm there." The missionary and merchant were already climbing down, but Evelyn remained seated. "My trunk will have to stay with the stage, miss," We can't manage it. In this weather. Now come along, unless you're planning to freeze to death right there." She had no choice but to follow them into the howling white void. The wind cut through her wool coat as if it were silk, and her kid leather boots offered little protection against the deep snow. She could barely see the others ahead of her, dark shapes in a world gone white. But when they reached the spot, where the line shack should have been, they found only an empty clearing. The storm had turned them around, stolen their bearings. The driver's face went pale. "Keep moving," he shouted over the wind. "There's a ranch a few miles north, if we can reach it." But Evelyn never heard the rest. Her foot caught on something. It buried in the snow, and she pitched forward. By the time she regained her feet, the others had vanished into the storm. She called out, but the wind swallowed her voice. She was alone in the heart of Wyoming territory, with night falling and the storm showing no signs of mercy. Jake McCall knew every sound his ranch house could make. 2 years of solitude had taught him the language of empty rooms, the settling of old timber, the whisper of wind through cedar shakes, the soft creak of floorboards expanding in the morning sun. That's why the new sound caught his attention immediately. Tracks in the fresh snow, heading straight across his north pasture. The chain around his neck felt heavy as he stood at the window, his dead wife's wedding ring pressing. Cold against his chest. Sarah would have already been out there, investigating. She'd never had his tendency toward darkness. But Sarah was gone, just like everything else that had once made this place more than a collection of weathered buildings and hard work. He pulled his old cavalry coat from its peg, the blue wool still bearing the marks of battles long past. The war had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about those tracks raised the hair on the back of his neck. "Getting soft," he muttered to himself, checking his revolver before sliding it into his holster. The townspeople's whispers had reached even his isolated ears. How they called him the Widowmaker, claiming Sarah's death had frozen his heart solid. On his monthly trips into Thunder Valley for supplies, mothers pulled their children closer. When he passed, men found urgent business elsewhere. Only old Sam at the general store still treated him like a human being. "Ain't natural, where you wall yourself off," Sam had said just last week, measuring out coffee beans. Sarah's not here to want anything," Jake had cut him off. End of discussion. Now, as he saddled his stallion Ghost, the morning sun caught the silver streaks in his dark hair. At 40, he was young to be such a recluse, but age had little to do with the weight he carried. The tracks led him along the fence line, past the spring that never quite froze, and the lightning-struck oak where he and Sarah had once picnicked. He tried not to look at these landmarks anymore, these monuments to happiness lost. Instead, he focused on reading the snow. Someone on foot, he determined. Small prints, probably a woman or youth. Uneven spacing suggested exhaustion or injury. Recent, despite the storm's attempt to erase them. His jaw clenched. The last thing he needed was some lost traveler bringing chaos to his carefully ordered solitude. Ghost's ears suddenly pricked forward. Jake followed the horse's gaze to a dark shape half buried in a snowdrift. His first thought was of wolves. They'd been bold lately, coming down from the high country, but as he drew closer, he saw it was human. A woman by the cut of her clothes, though they were unlike anything worn in Thunder Valley. Too fine, too eastern. She lay curled against the brutal wind, her face hidden by a fur-trimmed hood. Jake dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. "Ma'am?" No response. He touched her shoulder gently, felt the dangerous coldness of her skin through the fabric. Still breathing, thank God. But not for long in this weather. The logical thing would be to ride for the doctor, but Thunder Valley was a good 4 hours away in this weather, and she'd be dead long before help arrived. Which left only one choice, the very one he'd been avoiding for 2 years, bringing a stranger into his home. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper on the wind as he lifted the unconscious woman onto Ghost's back. "Some things are worth the risk of getting hurt again." "Not this time," he answered aloud, though he secured the woman carefully before mounting. Behind her, Just until the storm passes, then she moves on. But as they rode toward the ranch house, snow falling thick around them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change. Like the first time he'd seen Sarah at a town social, or the moment he'd decided to settle in Wyoming territory after the war. Some choices once made couldn't be unmade. The woman stirred slightly, unconsciously leaning back against his chest for warmth. Jake stiffened, already regretting his decision. But he was committed now, for better or worse. Ghost picked his way carefully through the deepening snow, carrying them home to a house that hadn't welcomed a visitor since the day they'd buried Sarah beneath the winter bare cottonwoods. Consciousness returned to Evelyn in stages. First came the sensation of warmth, then the crackling of a fire, and finally the realization that she was lying on something soft instead of in the killing snow. Her fingers instinctively went to her throat, finding her cameo still there, but when she tried to sit up, every muscle screamed in protest. "I wouldn't do that just yet." The voice was deep, rough-edged like weathered stone. Evelyn forced her eyes open to find herself in a Spartan but well-kept room. A fire blazed in the hearth, and beside it sat a man who looked as untamed as the territory itself. "My trunk," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "The stage, gone with the storm, most likely." He didn't move from his chair, just watched her with eyes the color of storm clouds. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Blackwood, Evelyn Blackwood." She tried to smooth her hair, acutely aware of how inappropriate this situation would be in Boston society. "And you are?" "Jake McCall." He stood, moving to pour something from a kettle. "This is my ranch you wandered onto." The cup he offered held coffee, strong enough to make her eyes water, but it chased away the last of the bone-deep cold, so she didn't complain. "I must thank you for your assistance, Mr. McCall. Once the storm passes, I'll compensate you for your trouble and make my way to Thunder Valley. I'm expected at the schoolhouse there." A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his face. "Thunder Valley's schoolhouse has been empty 3 years. Last teacher left after 2 months. Couldn't handle the isolation. I assure you I received a telegram." She reached for her reticule, only to realize it was missing. "Found this in the snow near you." He retrieved her small bag from a hook by the fire. "Though any paper inside is probably ruined." The telegram, when she pulled it out, had indeed been reduced to a soggy mess, the words bleeding into illegibility. Evelyn felt her carefully constructed future dissolving with the ink. "Perhaps there's been a mistake," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "If I could just get to town, Storm's got other ideas." Jake moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain. Outside, the world had vanished into white chaos. "We're locked in for at least 2 days, maybe more." Her heart sank. 2 days alone with a strange man? Her reputation would be ruined. Not that she had much of one left, being an unmarried woman of her age. Still, there were proprieties to consider. Surely there must be neighbors nearby. Nearest neighbors 15 miles south. And before you ask, no, I won't risk riding out in this. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You'll have to make do with what hospitality I can offer. There's a bedroom down the hall, my late wife's sewing room. You can sleep there." The word wife simultaneously relieved and distressed her. At least he was a widower, not some bachelor of questionable character. But the way he said, "late," wife, carried a weight of grief that filled the room like smoke. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Don't be. You didn't cause it." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. "Can you walk?" Evelyn pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. Her fashionable boots, now ruined, had protected her feet poorly from the cold. Each step sent needles of pain through her toes. Jake watched her struggle for 3 steps before sighing. Without warning, he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing. Evelyn was so startled she forgot to protest. "This is highly irregular," she managed as he carried her down the hall. "So is freezing to death in Wyoming territory wearing city boots," he countered. You'll need to learn different rules out here, Miss Blackwood, if you plan to survive. The room he brought her to was small but neat, dominated by a quilted bed and a sewing machine by the window. The air held a faint scent of lavender, as if its previous occupant had only recently left. He set her down carefully on the bed. "Rest. We'll figure out what to do with you when the storm passes." "Mr. McCall," she called as he reached the door, "thank you for saving my life." He paused, one hand on the doorframe. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Blackwood. Storm's just beginning." Whether he meant the one outside or something else entirely, Evelyn couldn't tell. But as she lay back on the unfamiliar bed, listening to his boots retreat down the hall, she had the unsettling feeling that both their lives had just taken an unexpected turn. Night fell early, hastened by the storm's dark clouds. Evelyn had dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with swirling snow and the echo of hoofbeats. When she woke, the room was dark except for a thin line of lamplight under the door. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast on the stage. Still, the thought of facing Mr. McCall again made her hesitate. In the growing darkness, Sarah's sewing room felt like a sanctuary, the only space in this strange house where she could pretend to be in control of her situation. A knock at the door startled her. "Miss Blackwood, supper's ready, if you're feeling up to it." Her proper upbringing warred briefly with her hunger. Hunger won. "Thank you, I'll be right there." She found him in the kitchen, setting out beans, bread, and what looked like venison stew. The domesticity of the scene struck her. This dangerous-looking man, carefully laying out 2 bowls, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. "It's not what you're used to," he said, not looking up, "but it'll keep you alive." "I'm sure it will be fine." She settled into the offered chair, trying not to show how her feet still ached. "Do you always cook for yourself?" "Since Sarah died." He filled her bowl, his movements efficient. "Had to learn. Man can't live on coffee and bitter memories." The stew was surprisingly good, rich with herbs she couldn't name. They ate in silence, broken only by the howling wind and the occasional pop from the wood stove. Evelyn found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The way his hands dwarfed the spoon, the silver threading through his dark hair, the old scar that traced his jaw. "You have questions," he said finally. "Ask them. I wouldn't want to pry. You're stuck here at least 2 days. Might as well satisfy your curiosity," she considered carefully. "The townspeople, they call you the Widowmaker?" His face hardened. "People talk too much. Is it true that I killed my wife?" His laugh held no humor. "Not directly, but I might as well have." He pushed back from the table. "Sarah was like you, not made for this country, but she loved it anyway. Loved it enough to ride out in weather like this to help birth a neighbor's calf. Horse spooked, broke through river ice. By the time I found her..." He stopped, jaw working. "Well, people need someone to blame. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have..." "No, you shouldn't have." He stood, taking his bowl to the wash basin. "Bathroom's down the hall if you need it. I'll be in the barn, checking the animals. Lock your door tonight." "You think I need to? Lock my door?" He paused at the kitchen doorway. "No, but you'll feel better if you do." After he'd gone, Evelyn remained at the table, staring at her half-empty bowl. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house, a door creaked. She'd never felt more alone. On impulse, she began clearing the table. It was the least she could do after he'd saved her life. She found soap and a dish rag, familiar motions in an unfamiliar place. As she worked, she noticed things about the kitchen. A woman's touches not quite erased by time, curtains with hand-embroidered edges, a row of decorated tins, a shelf of carefully labeled preserves. Sarah's presence lingered here in every domestic detail. No wonder Jake McCall preferred the barn. When he returned an hour later, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped short at the sight of the clean kitchen. "You didn't have to do that." "No, but I wanted to." She'd found a kettle and managed to heat water for tea. "Would you like some?" For a moment she thought he might refuse, but something in the domesticity of the scene seemed to reach him. "Sure, why not?" They sat by the fire, steam rising from their cups. Outside the storm raged, but in here a fragile peace had been established. Not friendship exactly, but something like understanding. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Why? What's tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he said, rising. "You learn how not to be helpless in Wyoming territory." It wasn't until she was back in Sarah's room, door locked more out of habit than fear, that Evelyn realized she was actually looking forward to it. Dawn arrived with a stillness that made the previous night's storm feel like a dream. Evelyn woke to unfamiliar sounds: a rooster's crow, the distant lowing of cattle, and the crunch of boots on snow. She found her clothes from yesterday dried and neatly folded outside her door. Jake's work, though she couldn't imagine the rough-handed rancher pressing creases into her skirt. The kitchen was empty when she entered, but a fire already burned in the stove. Coffee bubbled in a battered pot, its aroma mixing with the crisp scent of winter air from the half-open door. She was pondering the mysteries of the coffee pot when Jake appeared, carrying an armload of firewood. "You'll want to wear these instead," he said, nodding toward a bundle on the table. Work clothes, men's clothes, lay neatly folded beside. A pair of worn boots. "I couldn't possibly, can't teach you ranch work with you tripping over skirts." He set the wood down. They were Sarah's, from when she helped with the cattle. The clothes felt like crossing a line. Wearing a dead woman's things, dressed as no proper lady should, yet the practical side of her knew he was right. "Where should I change?" "Take them back to your room. Coffee'll be ready when you return." The trousers felt scandalous against her legs, the boots heavy but surprisingly comfortable. When she caught her reflection in Sarah's small mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The woman staring back looked capable, ready for whatever the day might bring. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly when she returned, but he said nothing, just handed her a cup of coffee and a plate of beans and salt pork. "Eat up, you'll need your strength." "For what, exactly?" "For learning how to survive out here." He studied her over his coffee cup. "Starting with how to keep the fire going. Can't have you freezing if I'm out dealing with the stock." The morning passed in a blur of practical lessons. Jake proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to bank coals, where to find kindling, the proper way to stack logs. When she nearly burned herself, his hand shot out to catch her wrist, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Careful," he said softly, then seemed to realize he was still holding her. He dropped her hand as if it burned. "Let's move on to the pump. Need to break the ice before it freezes solid." Outside, the world sparkled. Fresh snow blanketed everything, transforming the weathered ranch buildings into something out of a fairy tale. But the cold bit through her borrowed clothes, reminding her this was no story for children. "Watch your step," Jake warned as they approached the pump. "Ice here's treacherous." As if his words were prophecy, Evelyn's foot slipped. She grabbed the nearest support, which happened to be Jake. For one startled moment they stood frozen, her hands clutching his coat, his arm instinctively around her waist. She could feel the strength in him, smell the leather and pine scent of his clothes. "Sorry," she managed, stepping back carefully. "These boots take smaller steps," he said gruffly, turning to the pump. "You're not used to the weight yet." They worked together to break the ice, their breath forming clouds in the morning air. Despite the cold, Evelyn found herself enjoying the simple task. There was satisfaction in doing something useful, something real. "You're stronger than you look," Jake commented as she helped him work the pump handle. "Is that a compliment, Mr. McCall?" An observation, but there was something like approval in his eyes. "Come on, time you learned about feeding stock." As they walked toward the barn, Evelyn realized she'd completely forgotten about proper behavior, about her ruined plans, about everything except the immediate tasks at hand. Perhaps that was what Wyoming territory did to a person. Stripped away the unnecessary until only the essential remained, like the way Jake's hand had felt on her wrist, warm and steady in a world of ice. By late afternoon, Evelyn's muscles ached in ways she'd never experienced. She'd learned to feed chickens, carry water, and identify different types of feed. Jake had shown her how to check for frozen water troughs and mend a broken fence post. Through it all, he'd maintained a professional distance, as if teaching survival skills to stranded Boston ladies was an everyday occurrence. Now, as early darkness crept across the snow-covered yard, they returned to the house. Jake paused at the door, studying the western sky, storms circling back. Might be stuck here another day or two. The thought didn't disturb her as much as it should have. I should check the fireplace in my room, she said, remembering his morning lessons. The coals might need... She stopped. Down the hallway, past her borrowed room, a door stood ajar that had been closed before. Through the gap, she caught a glimpse of something unexpected. Books, rows and rows of books. Jake noticed her distraction. Ah, meant to keep that door closed. You have a library? She couldn't keep the wonder from her voice. He shifted uncomfortably. Just some books I've collected over the years. Before she could stop herself, Evelyn was moving down the hall. The room beyond that door called to her like a siren's song. When Jake didn't protest, she pushed it open fully and stepped inside. The library wasn't large, but every wall held floor-to-ceiling shelves, each one crammed with books. A leather armchair sat beside a window, a small reading table beside it. The last rays of sunlight caught the gilt titles on leather spines. Shakespeare, Milton, Thoreau, Whitman. These weren't just any books. This was a carefully curated, a collection. Mr. McCall, she breathed, these are first editions. Some of them. He remained in the doorway, as if reluctant to enter. Found most of them back east after the war. Others came from estate sales, traders passing through. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles, classical literature, philosophy, poetry, scientific treatises. These must have cost a fortune to transport out here. Sarah thought I was crazy. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Said I could have bought a whole herd of cattle for what it cost to ship them. But she understood. Understood what? That some men need more than just land and cattle to feel alive. He finally stepped into the room, moving to the shelves with the familiarity of long habit. Books were my escape during the war. Kept me sane in the hospital after Antietam. Reminded me there was still beauty in the world. Evelyn watched as he pulled a volume from the shelf, a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. You've read them all? Most. Several times. He handed her the book. Sarah used to read aloud while I worked on saddles in the evening. She had a way with the verses. The book fell open to Sonnet 29, when, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. The pages were annotated in two different hands, one sharp and masculine, the other flowing and feminine. Jake and Sarah sharing thoughts across time through Shakespeare's words. I never expected... Evelyn paused, realizing how that would sound. Never expected a rough rancher to appreciate Shakespeare. His voice held no offense. Out here, we're all more than we appear, Miss Blackwood. The territory demands it. She looked up from the book to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For the first time, she saw past the widow-maker reputation to the complexity beneath. A man who could break ice at dawn and read poetry at dusk. Would you... She hesitated, then pressed on. Would you read something? I've spent all day learning your world. Perhaps you could share a piece of mine? For a moment she thought he'd refuse, but then he took the book, settled into the leather chair, and began to read. His voice, usually so gruff, softened around the familiar words. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Evelyn sat on the window seat watching the last light fade as Jake's voice filled the room. Outside, snow began to fall again. But in here, two worlds had found common ground on the printed page. When he finished reading, a silence fell that neither seemed willing to break. Finally, Jake closed the book carefully. Best see to dinner, he said, rising. Learning to survive works up an appetite. But as he passed her on his way out, he paused. The library's yours to use, Miss Blackwood. Books shouldn't sit unread. She waited until his footsteps faded before running her hands across the spines again. These books were a window into Jake McCall's soul, one he'd just willingly opened for her. The question was, what would she find if she looked through it? Morning came, with aching muscles and frost-etched windows. Evelyn dressed in Sarah's work clothes without hesitation this time, her fingers remembering the unfamiliar buttons and ties. When she entered the kitchen, Jake was already there, but he wasn't alone. A massive black dog lay by the stove, its tail thumping against the floorboards at her entrance. Jake looked up from his coffee. "That's Bear. He was out with the cattle during the storm. Thought he might not make it back." Bear rose and padded over to inspect her, his nose cold against her hand. After a moment's consideration, he leaned, his weight against her legs, nearly knocking her over. "He likes you," Jake said, something soft crossing his face. Sarah was the only other person he did that with. The dog followed them outside, where the morning air bit sharp enough to steal breath. Jake handed her a pair of work gloves, Sarah's again, worn soft with use. "Today," he said, leading her toward the barn, "you learn about horses." Inside, the barn was warm with animal heat and the sweet smell of hay. Jake's stallion Ghost occupied the first stall, his pale coat almost luminous in the dim light. Next to him stood a smaller bay mare who stretched her neck out curiously. "This is Belle," Jake said, opening her stall. "Sarah's horse. Gentlest. Creature on 4 legs." Evelyn approached carefully, remembering distant lessons from childhood visits to her grandfather's estate. But this was different. No groom to hold the reins, no mounting block, no side saddle. "She needs brushing," Jake said, handing her a curry comb. "Start at the neck, work your way back, firm but gentle, like this." He demonstrated, his large hand covering hers to show the proper motion. The touch sent warmth up her arm despite the morning chill. Jake seemed to feel it too, releasing her hand quickly. But he stayed close as she worked, adjusting her technique with quiet words and the occasional guiding touch. "Good," he said as she finished. "Now for the hard part." The hard part turned out to be learning to saddle a horse properly. Jake walked her through each step, blanket, saddle, cinch, breast collar. His hands steadied her when she struggled with the weight of the saddle, showing her how to lift and place it smoothly. "Too loose and you'll slip sideways," he explained, reaching around her to check the cinch. "Too tight and you'll hurt her." He was close enough that she could feel the heat of him against her back, smell the leather and pine scent that clung to his clothes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Bear broke the spell, barking at something outside. Jake stepped back, clearing his throat. "Think you can do it again on your own?" She did, though her hands shook slightly. When she finished, he inspected her work with professional scrutiny. Not bad. He adjusted one strap slightly. "Ready to ride?" "Ride? In trousers? Unless you'd prefer your proper Boston skirts." His eyes held a challenge. Pride made her straighten her spine. "Show me how." He taught her to mount properly, to hold the reins, to move with the horse's gait. Belle proved patient with her awkward attempts, and soon they were walking steady circles in the snowy corral. Jake rode Ghost beside her, calling out corrections and encouragement. "Relax your shoulders," he said. "Horse can feel every tension in your body. Like this?" She tried to loosen her grip on the reins. "Better. Now." He broke off as Belle suddenly shied at a snowball falling from the roof. Evelyn started to panic, but Jake's voice cut through her fear. "Stay calm. Pull gently on the right rein." That's it. Belle settled, and Evelyn realized she hadn't fallen. She'd handled it, just as he'd taught her. "Well done," Jake said softly. The praise in his voice made her cheeks warm. They rode until the sun stood high, Jake teaching her the basics of controlling a horse with subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure. By the time they returned to the barn, Evelyn felt different, stronger, more capable. As they unsaddled the horses, Jake watched her work with an unreadable expression. "You're full of surprises, Miss Blackwood." "How so?" "Most city ladies would have given up by now, gone back to their books and tea parties." She thought of the library, of his hidden depths. "Perhaps we're both more than we appear, Mr. McCall." His eyes met hers over Belle's back. and something electric passed between them. Then Bear barked again, and the moment shattered like ice. Evening found them in the library, the storm having driven them inside early. A fire crackled in the hearth, and Bear dozed at their feet. Jake sat in his leather chair while Evelyn occupied the window seat, both of them with books in hand. But neither was reading. "Tell me about Boston," Jake said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "What makes a lady leave all that behind for Wyoming territory?" Evelyn traced the spine of her book, Thoreau's Walden, considering her answer. "Would you believe me if I said I was running away? From what? Expectations, pitying looks, the weight of being the woman who couldn't find a husband." She smiled without humor. "In Boston, I'm an object of concern. Poor Miss Blackwood, married to her father's library. Such a shame," they whisper. "She could have made a fine match if she weren't so educated." Jake shifted in his chair. "And that telegram promised escape? It promised purpose, a chance to use my education instead of hiding it." She turned. "To watch snow falling outside. Even if the position no longer exists, I can't go back. I sold most of my father's books to get here. All except the clothes on your back and that cameo." Her hand went to her throat, finding the familiar shape. "My mother's, the only thing I have of hers. She's gone? Since I was 12. Father never remarried, just buried himself in his books and left me to raise myself." She turned back to him. "Your turn, Mr. McCall. What brings a man who reads Shakespeare to the wilds of Wyoming?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "War has a way of making cities feel too small. After Antietam, after the hospital, I needed space, room to breathe. And you found it here? Found more than that." He touched the ring hanging from his neck. "Found Sarah. She was the doctor's daughter, the only person in town who didn't treat me like some damaged veteran. How did she, if you don't mind, die?" His voice was rough. "Stubborn woman, wouldn't listen when I said the weather was turning. Neighbor's wife was having a difficult birth, and Sarah had helped with deliveries before. Horse spooked crossing Miller's Creek. By the time I found her—" He stopped, jaw working. 2 years ago yesterday." Understanding dawned. "That's why. You were out in the storm. You were looking for her trail. Foolish habit, like somehow this time I'll find her before—" He broke off as Bear whined and pressed against his legs. "Anyway, that's why folks call me the Widowmaker. They figure I should have stopped her. Should have known better. But you couldn't have." Evelyn surprised herself by crossing to him, laying a hand on his shoulder. "We can't control the ones we love. Believe me, I tried with Father. All his books couldn't save him from his grief." Jake's hand came up to cover hers, rough and warm. "Guess we've both got our ghosts." "Yes," she said softly, "but at least yours loved you back." He looked up at her then, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. Without thinking, she started to lean down. A log crashed in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. They jerked apart. Bear raised his head, looking between them curiously. "It's late," Jake said, standing abruptly. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow. We should get some rest." "Of course." Evelyn stepped back, smoothing her borrowed clothes. "Thank you for sharing your story." He paused at the door. "Miss Blackwood?" "Yes?" "Those Boston folks were wrong about you. Education isn't something to hide. Sarah taught me that." Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. Evelyn sank into his vacant chair, still warm from his presence. Bear padded over to rest his head on her knee. "Oh dear," she whispered to the dog. "This is becoming—" "Complicated, isn't it?" Bear's only answer was a sympathetic whine. Morning brought clear skies and sharp-edged shadows across the snow. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake work in the corral. After last night's almost kiss in the library, breakfast had been a quiet affair of avoided glances and careful distances. She was washing the breakfast dishes when she heard the sleigh bells. Jake heard them too. She saw him straighten, hand going to his hip where she knew he kept his revolver. But as the sleigh crested the hill, his posture relaxed. "Doc Miller," he called out when Evelyn joined him on the porch. "What brings you out this way?" The doctor was a weathered man with kind eyes and a silver beard. His gaze moved between them, taking in Evelyn's borrowed clothes and their shared porch space. "Checking on folks after the storm," he said, climbing down. "Word in town is the stage lost a passenger. Seems they found her trunk half buried in a drift." His eyes settled on Evelyn. "You must be Miss Blackwood." "The school teacher," Jake added, something odd in his voice. "Ah." The doctor's expression shifted. "About that. Miss Blackwood, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The telegram you received, it wasn't authorized by the town council." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "What?" "Someone's idea of a cruel joke, sending false telegrams to Eastern ladies. You're the third one this year." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "The stage company found this in your trunk. They're offering free passage back to Cheyenne." Jake's face had gone hard as granite. "You knew about these false telegrams?" "Jake, how long has this been happening?" "The council's been investigating." "And nobody thought to warn the stations?" "The drivers," Jake's voice rose. "They left her in a blizzard. I'm sure they didn't mean she could have died out there." "Mr. McCall." Evelyn's quiet voice cut through his anger. "Please, it's not the doctor's fault." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Doc Miller cleared his throat. "Stage leaves for Cheyenne tomorrow morning. I can take you into town today, Miss Blackwood." "Thank you." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "If I could just gather my things." She fled into the house, barely making it to Sarah's room before the tears started. Everything she'd sold, everything she'd risked, all for a cruel joke. She began changing back into her city clothes with trembling fingers. The door opened behind her. "Miss Blackwood, don't!" She couldn't face him. "Please, Mr. McCall, I feel foolish enough." "You could stay." That made her turn. Jake stood in the doorway, something raw in his expression. "What?" "Town needs a teacher, whether the council knows it or not. I've got space in the house." "Books. You already know ranch work." "Stop." She held up a hand. "I won't be your charity case, Mr. McCall, or your replacement for Sarah." His face darkened. "That's not, isn't it? The educated woman who loves books, who needs saving." She yanked her corset tight with shaking hands. "I've spent my whole life being pitied. I won't start now." "Damn it, Evelyn, I'm not pitying you." The use of her first name shocked them both. "I'm offering you a choice." "No, you're offering me safety, security, just like every well-meaning person in Boston." She turned away, fighting fresh tears. "But I came west to prove I didn't need saving, even if it was all based on a lie. And what about what I need?" The raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. When she turned back, he'd moved closer, close enough to touch. "2 days ago," he said roughly, "this was just a house full of ghosts." Now, he reached for her face, then let his hand fall. "You've brought something back to life here. Something I thought died with Sarah. Jake." Her voice broke on his name. He stepped closer still. "Stay, not for safety, not for Sarah's memory. Stay because—" A sharp knock interrupted them. "Miss Blackwood?" Doc Miller called. "Sleigh's ready when you are." The spell broke. Evelyn stepped back, straightening her skirts. "Please tell the doctor I'll be right there." "Evelyn." "Goodbye, Mr. McCall." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Thank you for saving my life." She gathered her reticule and cameo, leaving Sarah's work clothes folded neatly on the bed. At the door, she paused. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." "I think I already did," he said softly. But by then, she was already gone, her skirts whispering down the hall like departing ghosts. Evelyn made it halfway to town before the fever hit. One moment she was sitting stiffly beside Doc Miller, the next she was swaying, the world turning grey at the edges. "Miss Blackwood?" The doctor's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Good Lord, you're burning up." She tried to answer, but her teeth had begun to chatter. The cold from her night in the snow had been waiting, it seemed, biding its time in her bones. "Have to get you back to McCall's," she heard the doctor say, "closest place with a proper bed." She wanted to protest, but darkness was creeping in. The last thing she remembered was the sleigh turning, bells jingling as they retraced their path through the snow. Fever dreams came and went. She was in Boston, in her father's library, but all the books were blank. She was lost in the snow again, but this time no one came. She was in Sarah's room, and Sarah herself sat beside the bed, young and beautiful and sad. "You're afraid," Dream Sarah said, "just like I was. Of dying, of living." Sometimes she heard real voices through the fever haze. Doc Miller speaking in low tones, Bear whining at the bedside, and Jake, always Jake, his voice rough with worry. "Fight it, Boston," he murmured. "You're stronger than this." Cool cloths appeared on her forehead. Strong hands lifted her to drink. Bitter tea. Someone held her when the chills got bad, and she thought she felt lips press against her hair. "Don't leave," she thought she whispered. "Everyone leaves." "Not this time," came the answer, but she couldn't tell if it was real or another fever dream. Reality returned in pieces. First the familiar ceiling of Sarah's room, then the weight of quilts, more than before. Finally, the sound of quiet breathing beside her. Jake sat in a chair by the bed, head bowed in sleep. He looked exhausted. His clothes rumpled, his jaw dark with stubble. Bear lay at his feet, but the dog's eyes were open, watching her. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Still, the small sound was enough to wake Jake. His eyes flew open, finding hers immediately. "Water," she managed to whisper. He helped her sit up, supporting her while she drank from a tin cup. His hand shook slightly where it cradled her head. "How long?" Her voice was barely there. 3 days. He set the cup aside, but didn't move away. "Doc wasn't sure you'd make it that first night. The exposure, the cold in your lungs." "I'm sorry. For what? Nearly dying?" His laugh held no humor. "Seems to be a habit around here. For trying to leave." His hand tightened on her shoulder. "Rest. We can talk when you're stronger." But she needed to say it now, while fever weakness made her brave. "You were right. I was running away. Not just from Boston, but from feeling anything. It was safer to be the spinster librarian than to risk—" "Hush." His finger pressed against her lips. "You're still feverish." "No." She captured his hand in hers. "I need you to understand. When I came west, I thought I was being brave. But real courage isn't about proving something. It's about being willing to risk everything, like Sarah did, riding out in that storm, like you did, offering me a place here." "Evelyn," her name was rough in his throat. "I'd like to stay," she whispered. "Not because I need saving, but because for the first time in my life I feel truly alive. You and your books, and this wild country." She had to stop, overcome by coughing. Jake held her through the spell, his arms strong and sure. When it passed, he didn't let go. "Sleep," he said softly. "I'll be here when you wake up. Promise?" "Promise." He settled her back against the pillows. "Gotta make sure you don't go running off to teach school in California or some such nonsense." She smiled despite her exhaustion. Too far to carry books. His answering chuckle was the last thing she heard as sleep took her again. But this time there were no fever dreams, only a deep, healing rest. And when she woke, he was still there, holding her hand as if he'd never let it go. Recovery came slowly, like spring creeping across the Wyoming plains. Evelyn spent her days in Sarah's room, which had somehow become her room without either of them mentioning it. Jake brought her books from the library, and they spent evenings reading aloud to each other while Bear dozed between them. One afternoon, Jake found her at Sarah's small writing desk, pen in hand. "Writing to Boston?" he asked, setting down a cup of tea. "Trying to." She gestured at the scattered papers. "How do I explain all this? Dear sister, I'm living unchaperoned with a rancher, wearing trousers and teaching myself to ride horses. Please don't tell the Ladies' Aid Society." He picked up one of her discarded attempts. "Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to inform you that the teaching position was a cruel hoax, but I've decided to stay in Wyoming territory anyway." He raised an eyebrow. "Might want to lead with something else." What would you suggest? Remember how you always said I'd die an old maid. Well, I've found a widower who reads Shakespeare and owns more books than father did. The words hung in the air between them. They hadn't discussed what they were to each other, not really. Not since her fever broke. Jake set the letter down, carefully. Is that what you want to tell her? I don't know what I want to tell her. Evelyn fiddled with her pen. Everything I write sounds either scandalous or defensive. I'm not ashamed of being here, but I don't know how to make them understand. Then don't try. He pulled Sarah's old chair beside the desk. Tell them what's in your heart, not what you think they want to hear. She dipped her pen in ink and began again. Dearest Margaret, I know this letter will worry you, but I need you to trust that I've found something extraordinary here. You always said I lived too much in books, that real life was passing me by. You were right in a way, but what you didn't understand was that I was waiting, not for a husband or security, but for a life that felt true. I found that life here, Margaret, among snow-covered mountains and endless skies, with a man who understands that love isn't about fitting someone else's expectations, but about making room for who we really are. Jake's hand covered hers, stilling the pen. You know this won't be easy. Town's already talking. Let them talk. She turned her hand to lace her fingers with his. I'm done living for other people's approval. Even your sister's? Even hers? Evelyn smiled, though I think she'll come around when I tell her about the library. She always said only another book lover would put up with me. He laughed, then grew serious. I've been thinking. The old schoolhouse needs work, but with some repairs. He hesitated. Town children should have a proper education, and their teachers should have a proper place to teach. Jake McCall, are you offering to renovate a schoolhouse for me? For the children, he corrected, but his eyes were warm. Though having the teacher live at my ranch might cause some gossip. More gossip, you mean? She squeezed his hand. Unless the teacher wasn't just living at your ranch. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. Unless she had a right to be there. As your wife, the word hung between them like a fragile bird. Jake's hand tightened on hers. You sure about this, Boston? No going back if we do this. I'm sure. She touched the ring that still hung around his neck. Sarah taught you love was worth the risk. Maybe it's time I learned that lesson too. He pulled her to her feet, one hand cupping her face. Guess I better talk to the preacher then. Guess you better. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, like every book she'd ever read about love, but real and solid and true. Later, she added a postscript to her letter. P.S. You'll need a new dress for the wedding. But mind, you bring one that won't mind a little Wyoming dust. This is a working ranch, after all, and I've grown rather fond of trousers. The day Jake removed Sarah's ring from around his neck, the first crocus pushed through the melting snow. Evelyn found him kneeling beside the small grave beneath the cottonwoods, Bear standing sentinel beside him. I'm not replacing you, she heard him whisper, his fingers tracing the carved letters on the wooden cross. Just making room for someone else to love, like you always said I should. She waited until he stood before approaching. Without a word, he took her hand and pressed the ring into it. The gold was warm from his skin. It's been long enough, he said quietly. Time to let the past rest. Together they buried the ring at the foot of Sarah's grave. As they walked back to the house, Evelyn spotted green shoots emerging everywhere the snow had retreated. Winter's finally breaking, she said, squeezing his hand. About time. He looked at her sideways. Speaking of time, Doc Miller's bringing the preacher out next week, if you're still sure about this. I am. She stopped, turning to face him. Are you? Instead of answering, he pulled her close and kissed her, right there in the muddy yard. When they parted, his eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. Got work to do before then, he said gruffly. Schoolhouse needs a new roof, and you need to learn to shoot. Shoot? Can't have my wife unable to protect herself when I'm out with the herd. He led her toward the barn. Besides, Sarah would never forgive me if I didn't teach you properly. The rifle he brought out was beautiful, all polished wood and blued. Steel. First rule, he said, showing her how to hold it, is respect. This isn't Boston anymore. Out here, a gun's as necessary as a plow. His hands positioned her arms, adjusted her stance. Teaching her to shoot wasn't so different from teaching her to ride. The same patient instruction, the same careful touches. By sunset, she'd managed to hit the fence post 3 times out of 10. Not bad for a beginning, he said as they walked back to the house. Though we might want to wait until you're a better shot before telling your sister about this part. Margaret would swoon at the very idea, Evelyn laughed. Though not as much as when I tell her about the cattle branding next month. You're not ready for branding yet. Watch me, Mr. McCall. He caught her around the waist, pulling her close. Already do, Miss Blackwood. More than I should. Inside, the house felt different. The rooms that had once echoed with emptiness now held the warmth of possibility. They worked together to prepare dinner, moving around each other in the kitchen, with growing familiarity. Afterward, Jake brought out paper and ink. Time to plan, he said, spreading the materials on the table. School needs more than just a roof. Windows, desks, books. Books we have plenty of. These aren't just for reading, Boston. These are for teaching. He began writing. Primers, slates, arithmetics. Town council won't help, not at first. We'll have to do it ourselves. We, she repeated softly, loving how naturally he included her in his plans. Might have to sell some cattle, he continued. But if we start small, maybe 6 or 8 students. And where will these students come from? The town that calls you Widowmaker? He looked up, jaw set. Things change. People change. You taught me that. She covered his hand with hers. And what about the ranch, the cattle? You can't manage everything alone while I'm teaching. Already thought of that. Miller's boy Tom needs work. Good kid, knows horses. Could help out, live in the old bunkhouse. He hesitated. If you don't mind having someone else around. Our home will have plenty of people around, she said firmly. Students, workers, maybe even my sister when she finally visits. No more isolation, Jake, for either of us. He nodded slowly. Guess I better fix up that bunkhouse then, and the cookhouse, and the... She silenced him with a kiss. When she pulled back, his eyes were darker than the Wyoming night. One thing. At a time, she said softly, we have the rest of our lives to build this place into what we want it to be. Outside, the wind had changed, carrying the scent of thaw and growing things. Spring was coming to Wyoming territory, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. Thunder Valley wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and scattered houses connected by muddy streets. But as Jake helped Evelyn down from the wagon, it felt like every eye in town was watching. Them. Widowmaker's got himself a woman, someone muttered from the saloon porch. Poor thing doesn't know what she's in for. Jake's hand tightened on hers, but Evelyn held her head high. She'd traded Sarah's work clothes for her own Boston dress today, though she kept the sturdy boots hidden beneath her skirts. Some battles weren't worth fighting yet. They headed for the general store first. Old Sam's eyebrows shot up when they entered together, Jake's hand at the small of her back. Well now, the storekeeper said, this is a surprise. Need supplies, Sam, Jake said gruffly, for the schoolhouse. Schoolhouse? Sam looked between them. That old wreck out by Miller's place? The very one. Evelyn stepped forward, pulling out her list. We'll need nails, window glass, primer books, and slate pencils for a start. We? Sam's weathered face cracked into a smile. So the rumors are true then? You're staying, miss? She's not just staying, Jake said. We're getting married next week. The silence that followed was broken by the store's bell as Mrs. Miller entered, followed by 2 other women Evelyn didn't know. Their whispered conversation stopped dead at the sight of Jake and Evelyn together. Married? Mrs. Miller's voice was sharp. To the Widowmaker. To Mr. McCall, Evelyn corrected firmly, who has kindly offered to help restore the schoolhouse. For the town's children. Our children don't need, don't they? Evelyn turned to face the women fully. I saw 3 boys playing marbles in the street just now. Do they read, write, know their sums, Or are they growing up wild because this town is too afraid of change to give them a proper education? Now see here, one of the other women began. No, you see here. Evelyn's voice was quiet, but carried the authority of every Boston drawing room she'd ever managed. I came west because I believe children here deserve the same opportunities as children back east. The fact that I found love along the way doesn't change that mission. So you can either help us build something good for this town, or you can stand in that saloon and whisper about the Widowmaker. Your choice. The store had gone so quiet you could hear the wooden floors creaking. Then Sam started to laugh. Lord Almighty Jake, he wheezed, you sure found yourself a firecracker. That I did. Jake's voice held pride and something else, a warmth that made the women blink and look at him differently. Mrs. Miller stepped forward, studying Evelyn carefully. You're really planning to teach? Even after? She glanced at Jake. Even after finding out about the false telegram? Yes. Your town needs a school. Your children need an education. And Mr. McCall needs... She smiled up at Jake. Well, he needs someone to organize his library properly. A ripple of surprised laughter went through the store. Mrs. Miller's face softened slightly. Thomas does need to learn his letters, she admitted. He's 7 now, and wild as a March hare. Then help us, Evelyn said. Spread the word. We'll need families willing to send their children, hands to help with repairs. And ladies willing to act as proper chaperones, Jake added, making everyone stare at him. Can't have my future wife's reputation sullied by town gossip, now can we? Mrs. Miller's mouth twitched. Well, I suppose not. She straightened her shawl. I'll speak to the other mothers. Perhaps we could meet next week to discuss what the school might need. I'd like that very much. As the women left, Sam began gathering their supplies. Clever, he said to Jake, using their own propriety against them. Learned from the best. Jake squeezed Evelyn's hand. Sarah always said this town needed shaking up. Guess she finally got her wish. Outside, the spring sun had broken through the clouds. As they loaded their supplies, Evelyn noticed the whispers had changed tone. Still curious, still cautious, but no longer hostile. That went better than expected, she said as they climbed into the wagon. Give it time. Jake picked up the reins. Town's like a wild horse. Have to gentle it slow. Good thing I'm learning. About horses, then. His answering laugh carried across the muddy street, making heads turn. The Widowmaker was laughing. Maybe, the town thought, maybe things really were changing. The telegram arrived 3 days before the wedding. Evelyn was in the schoolhouse, supervising as Jake and Tom installed new windows, when young Billy from the telegraph office rode up. Urgent message, Miss Blackwood. He waved the yellow paper. Like a flag. All the way from Boston. Her heart sank. Only one person would send an urgent telegram, Margaret. She'd written to her sister weeks ago, but hadn't expected such a swift response. Jake climbed down from his ladder, sawdust coating his shirt. Want me to send him away? No. She squared her shoulders. Better face it now. The telegram was long, expensive. Margaret had never been one to spare words or expense when making her point. Received your letter. Stop father's lawyer, found his will. Stop you are sole heir to library and trust. Stop must return. Boston immediately to claim inheritance. Stop position secured at university library. Stop come home before you throw away everything. Stop Margaret. Evelyn read it twice, then handed it to Jake. His face darkened as he scanned the words. How much? He asked quietly. The trust. I'm not sure. Father's library was valuable, but no. He crumpled the telegram. How much does Boston mean to you? She looked around the half-finished schoolhouse. New windows let in streams of spring sunlight. Fresh-cut lumber waited to become desks. On the wall, she'd already sketched where bookshelves would go. I thought I knew, she said slowly. All those years in Father's library, I thought books were everything. But now I understand why Sarah rode out in that storm, why you stayed here after losing her. Some things are worth more than security. He stepped closer, touched her cheek. A university library's quite an offer. It's a cage, Jake, a beautiful book-lined cage. She covered his hand with hers. I'd rather build something real here. With you, even if it means giving up your inheritance. The money would be useful, she admitted. We could fix up the school properly, buy more cattle. But Margaret knows. That, she's trying to force my hand. Tom cleared his throat from the window. Begging your pardon, Miss Blackwood, but ain't there lawyers in Cheyenne? Could send one to Boston, handle things proper-like without you leaving. Jake and Evelyn stared at the young ranch hand. Tom, Jake said slowly, that's downright clever. Just common sense, boss. My ma always said never travel if you can. Send paper instead. Evelyn laughed, tension breaking. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. Would you ride into town, Tom? See if Sam knows any reliable lawyers in Cheyenne? Yes, he grinned, clearly pleased to be useful. Want me to send a telegram back to Boston while I'm there? She thought for a moment, then nodded. Tell them, claiming my inheritance, stop. But building my life here, stop sending lawyers, stop wedding next week, stop love Evelyn. After Tom rode off, Jake pulled her close. You sure about this? It's a lot to give up. I'm not giving up anything that matters. She breathed in his familiar scent of sawdust and leather. Besides, think of the library we can build here, not just for the school, but for everyone. A proper lending library, like they have back east. Turning my ranch into a cultural center, his voice held amusement. What's next? Poetry readings in the barn. Don't tempt me, Mr. McCall. He kissed her then, thoroughly enough that Mrs. Miller would have been scandalized if she weren't busy organizing the wedding preparations. Speaking of the wedding, he said when they parted, you sure you don't want to wait? Give your sister time to come around? Margaret will come around when she's ready, or she won't. Evelyn touched her mother's cameo. I spent too many years waiting for other people's approval. I'm done waiting. A meadowlark landed on the new windowsill, its song bright in the spring air. Outside, Thunder Valley spread under the vast Wyoming sky, nothing like the cramped streets of Boston. Here was room to grow, to build, to become who they were meant to be. Well then, Jake said, picking up his hammer, let's get this schoolhouse. Ready. Can't have my bride teaching in a half-finished building. Our building, she corrected, picking up a broom. Our life. The meadowlark's song followed them as they worked. A melody of promise and possibility. Boston could wait. This was where she belonged. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool. Evelyn stood in Sarah's room, her room now, smoothing the simple white dress Mrs. Miller had helped her alter. No Boston finery, just clean cotton and hand-worked lace. Her mother's cameo provided the only touch of elegance. A knock at the door made her turn. Come in! It was Doc Miller, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best. Miss Blackwood, there's someone here to see you. Her heart stopped. Margaret? He shook his head. No, miss, maybe you should come see for yourself. She followed him downstairs, holding her skirts clear of the steps. In the kitchen stood a man in an expensive Eastern suit, looking utterly out of place among the rough-hewn furniture. Miss Blackwood, he bowed slightly. I'm James Harrison, your father's solicitor. Your sister sent me. 3 hours before my wedding? Evelyn's voice was sharp. I thought we made arrangements. For this isn't about the inheritance, Miss Blackwood. He pulled an envelope from his coat. Your sister asked me to deliver this personally. She felt you should have all the facts before making such a momentous decision. The letter inside was written in Margaret's elegant hand. Dearest Evelyn, by the time you read this, you'll have already made your choice, but there's something you need to know. Father's death wasn't just grief, as we thought. He had debts, gambling debts. The library was mortgaged to pay them. The trust fund exists, yes, but it's barely enough to clear what he owed. I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you. The position at the university is real. They'll take you despite everything, give you a fresh start. Please, sister, don't throw away your last chance at security for some romantic notion of frontier life. The lawyer will wait to bring you home. Just say the word. With love and hope. Margaret Evelyn's hands shook as she lowered the letter. Everything she'd thought she was giving up, the library, the trust, the security of her old life, had been an illusion. Miss Blackwood? Harrison stepped forward. The morning train. To Cheyenne leaves in an hour. From there we can— No! The word came out stronger than she expected. But surely, given these circumstances change nothing. She squared her shoulders. Do you know what I've learned here, Mr. Harrison? That security isn't about money or position. It's about knowing who you are and what you're willing to fight for. Your sister wants to protect me. She always has. Evelyn smiled sadly. But I don't need protection anymore. A sound from the doorway made them turn. Jake stood there in his best shirt, looking at her with an expression that made her heart. Stop. Everything all right, Boston? She crossed to him, taking his hand. Everything's perfect. Mr. Harrison was just leaving. Miss Blackwood, the lawyer tried one last time. At least consider— Consider what? She faced him, still holding Jake's hand. Trading love for security. Trading purpose for safety. I did that for years in Boston. Never again. Harrison looked between them, something like understanding crossing his face. And the debts? Tell Margaret I'll help her handle them, but not by running away. I'm building something here, Mr. Harrison. A school, a library, a life. 2 lives, Jake said quietly. She squeezed his hand. 2 lives, she agreed. After Harrison left, Jake turned to her. Want to tell me what that was about? Just Boston trying one last time to call me home. She straightened his collar. But I already am home. He caught her hand, pressed it to his heart. Still time to change your mind, you know, before the whole town shows up. Jake McCall, if you're trying to talk me out of marrying you— Never, he smiled, the smile that had first shown her the man behind the Widowmaker legend. Just making sure you know what you're choosing. I do. She reached up, touched his face. I choose this. Every day, in every way, I choose this. Through the window came the sound of wagons, the town arriving for the wedding. Soon the house would be full of people, the yard decorated with wildflowers Mrs. Miller's girls had picked. A new chapter beginning. Well then, Jake said softly, let's go get married. They walked out together into the Wyoming morning, ready to write their own story. They married under the cottonwoods where Sarah rested, spring flowers dotting the grass like stars. The whole town turned out, filling the yard with more people than it had seen in years. Even old Sam closed his store for the occasion, serving as Jake's best man, while Mrs. Miller stood up for Evelyn. Bear watched the proceedings from his place beside the preacher, as if appointed guardian of the ceremony. When Jake and Evelyn joined hands, the dog's tail thumped against the new spring. Grass in approval. Marriage, the preacher began, is like the Wyoming territory itself, wild and beautiful, challenging and rewarding. It requires courage to venture into unknown lands and wisdom to build something lasting there. Evelyn, standing before Jake, in her simple white dress and her mother's cameo, felt the truth of those words. They were pioneers of a sort, stepping into their own uncharted territory. Do you, Jacob Matthew McCall, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Jake's hands were steady around hers. I do. And do you, Evelyn Grace Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Her voice carried across the yard, clear and sure. When Jake kissed her, the town's applause mixed with meadowlark song. Mrs. Miller wiped her eyes, murmuring something about new beginnings. Even the hardest faces in the crowd had softened, seeing the Widowmaker transformed by love. The celebration that followed was pure Wyoming territory. Tables groaned with food brought by every family, venison, fresh bread, pies of every description. Someone produced a fiddle, and Tom proved to have a fine singing voice, leading everyone in song as the spring sun began to set. Jake found her by the punch bowl, watching their guests dance in the yard. Happy? He asked softly. More than I knew was possible. She leaned against him. Though I think you've shocked the town by knowing how to waltz. Sarah taught me, he admitted. Said a man who could read Shakespeare ought to know how to dance properly. She was right about many things. Yes. He took her hand, rubbing his thumb across her new gold ring, including telling me I'd love again someday. Before she could respond, Mrs. Miller hurried up with an armful of papers. Here you are, dear. Every family with school-age children has signed up. 23 students. Can you imagine? Evelyn took the list, joy bubbling up. So many. We'll need more desks than we thought. Already ahead of you, Jake said. Tom and I figured out how to make them assembly line style. We'll have the first batch ready by next week. Mrs. Miller beamed at them both. To think we almost lost. You to Boston. But of course you belong here. Anyone can see that now. As the older woman hurried off to organize the serving of the wedding cake, Jake pulled Evelyn closer. She's right, you know. You do belong here. We belong here, she corrected. You, me, our books, our school. Even Bear, as if hearing his name. The dog trotted over to press against their legs. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the Wyoming sky, so much brighter than they'd ever been in Boston. I have something for you, Jake said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a book, a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. On the cover was tooled a single word, ours. Thought we could write our own story, he said quietly. Fill it with everything we build together. Tears pricked her eyes. Our story's just beginning, isn't it? God willing. He brushed away a tear with his thumb. Though I should warn you, life out here rarely goes according to plan. Good, she smiled up at him. I've had enough of other people's plans. Let's make our own. The fiddle struck up another tune, something slow and sweet. Jake took the journal and set it carefully aside, then pulled her into his arms. Dance with me, Mrs. McCall. The new name sent warmth through her heart. Always Mr. McCall. They moved together under the stars, their guests watching with approval. The widowmaker and his Boston lady, two worlds meeting on the Wyoming plains. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, students to teach, and a ranch to run. But tonight was for dancing, for celebration, for love that had bloomed unexpected as wildflowers after winter's thaw. Bear sat watching them, his tail sweeping the grass in steady rhythm. And somewhere, Evelyn thought, Sarah was watching too, smiling at the way life renewed itself, at the way love wrote new chapters in old stories. 1 year later, the schoolhouse bell rang across Thunder Valley, signaling the end of another day. Evelyn McCall stood in the doorway, watching her students scatter like quail into the late afternoon sunshine. 23 had grown to 35, with more expected when the mountain families came down for winter. Miss Evelyn, little Sarah Miller tugged at her skirt. Can I borrow another book? I finished Little Women last night. Of course, dear. Evelyn led her to the lending library that occupied one wall. Books from Boston shared space with new volumes, their spines bright against the fresh pine shelves Jake had built. How about Anne of Green Gables? I think you'll like Anne. As Sarah skipped away with her new treasure, hooves thundered outside. Jake had timed his return from the north pasture perfectly, as he did most days. Some of the children called out greetings as they passed. No fear now of the man they'd once called Widowmaker. Ready to head home, Mrs. McCall? He swung down from Ghost, who had gained a companion in the past year. A spirited mare, Evelyn, rode with growing confidence. Just need to record today's lending. She patted the ledger on her desk. Margaret will want to know how her latest donation is being used. Her sister's first visit 3 months ago had changed everything. Margaret had arrived full of doubt and citified criticism, but left converted to their cause. Now regular boxes of books arrived from Boston, along with news of their father's library being sold to pay his debts. But the loss no longer stung. They were building something better. Jake moved behind her desk, wrapping his arms around her waist. Speaking of records, did you write in our book today? The leather journal lay open beside the ledger, its pages filling with their shared story. Today's entry recorded Tommy Baker reading his first sentence and the way Jake had taught the older boys to mend fences during lunch break. Already done, She leaned back against him. Though we might need a new volume soon. This one's almost in full. Good thing I ordered two. He kissed her neck. Come on. Bear's probably wondering where his dinner is. They rode home together, the setting sun painting the prairie gold. The ranch had changed in a year. New paint on the buildings, flowers in Sarah's old garden, the bunkhouse alive with Tom's fiddle music. But the biggest change was inside the main house, where books and learning mixed easily with ranch life. Town council meeting tonight, Jake reminded her as they unsaddled the horses. They're voting on funding for the school's winter fuel. They'll approve it. Evelyn smiled. Mrs. Miller assured me she's brought everyone around. Amazing what a few well-educated grandchildren can do for people's generosity. Inside, Bear greeted them with his usual enthusiasm. The dog had grown, used to sharing his humans with students and ranch hands, though he still claimed his place by the fire during evening reading sessions. Later, after the council meeting, where the fuel funding passed unanimously, they sat in the library. Jake read aloud from Shakespeare while Evelyn worked on lesson plans. The scene was familiar now, comfortable as a well-worn saddle. Listen. Into this part, Jake said, his voice soft with meaning. But love, first learned in a lady's eyes, lives not alone immured in the brain, but with the motion of all elements, courses as swift as thought in every power, and gives to every power a double power, above their functions and their offices. Love's labor's lost, she identified without looking up. You're getting predictable, Mr. McCall. Am I? He set the book aside. Predictable enough that you've guessed why I've been smiling all day? Now she did look up. Jake? Doc Miller confirmed it this morning. Said everything looks fine, but you'll need to take it easier in the saddle soon. Her hand flew to her stomach, where the first subtle changes had only recently appeared. You knew? Suspected. Wanted to be sure before saying anything. His eyes were bright with joy. Looks like we'll need to add a nursery to our story. Evelyn moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. Sarah would be happy, wouldn't she? Seeing her home so full of life again? She'd be overjoyed. He pulled her close. Almost as overjoyed as I am, Mrs. McCall. Outside, stars appeared one by one over Wyoming territory. Inside, two people who had once been lost held each other, surrounded by books and memories and promises of tomorrow. Their story, like the leather journal on the desk, was still being written, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in daily choices to love, to build, to grow together. It wasn't the ending Evelyn had imagined. When she first stepped off that train in Cheyenne, it was better, it was real, it was theirs.